Hello and welcome to a discussion on Omniscient Awakening, DZ-BT05, the climax of Season 2 of Divine Z, which is between Rezael Vita, the episode just came out, and Varga as well, the new Varga. So, quite a bit to cover, but I'm only going to be covering anything that can help Rezael or Liael or generic cards. I'm not going to be covering any Youthberg stuff. No Alden, no Soriron either, unfortunately, as much as I'd love to cover it, but I've not actually played Soriron still. I own all these cards, but I haven't picked up my full playset still of Wisdom Claw Dragon, so I can't really build a proper deck out of it. So more or less, that's just how it's going to be. Focus on the fated ones for now. So to start off with, we'll go through the generic cards, and then later on we'll start going into the more archetype restricted stuff. So Be Thou a Knight Who Carries the Future. This is a blitz order. So obviously it clashes with other stuff like Heavenly Bright or Elementary Sanctude, if you choose to run it, but very good blitz order. It gains a lot of shield, 10k initially, but then on the third battle, an extra 5k. But then if you get to the fifth battle, an additional 5k, so 20k total. If your opponent has a G zone with a unit face up, then it's an additional 10k on top, so maximum 30k shield. So if your opponent plays a very aggressive deck, it's always going to be 20k shield, but if your opponent plays a stride deck, then it could end up being a 25 to 30k as well. Which I think against a deck like Shiranui is very easy to meet the condition for all of those, because there's a lot of attacks that go off in that turn, and they have a face-up unit, especially with Mug and Tembu triggering right away, because unlike, for example, Fate Rider, where you won't be able to use this face-up skill, the face-up G-Zone skill, against Fate Rider unless Fate Rider attacks, because that's when the G-Flip happens. Mug and Tembu is different because it happens during the main phase. It's quick. It gets the condition already set up. And speaking of that sort of condition, this one here. So if your opponent has a G-Zone, this is an extra 5k shield and power, so you can use it as an attacker as well. An additional 5k on top if your opponent has a face-up one as well. So if they've already started flipping, then it gets even stronger on top of all that. So they've made quite a few anti-G unit cards here. This one being the more reliable one. This one being a very dead card otherwise. But if you ever get into a format where stride decks are too strong for your deck, then you just shove this in and maybe hope and pray on this one. I mean, maybe they'll make some toolbox stuff as well, which, I don't know, maybe can make it a bit more justifiable, I don't know. Drill Twister Angel, a generic card. When it attacks, if you've already placed on a rear guard, other than from hand during the turn, you Soul Charge 1. So Soul Charge Engine, more or less, that can keep on recurring. It's a bit like a Drilling Angel, but the drill is not once only. It keeps happening, and it's blind as well, so you can't do selective Soul Charge. I think Drilling Angel will always be a bit more popular than this, but I think, but this is okay. It's just the thing is you're just never going to play it because there's other better stuff, especially in Liael. In Liael, you've got the new Sequence Wizard, but then Rezael has just a lot of Soul Charging in general to even care about this. But in theory, you could use it with something like Reedy, which is a grade 1 spammable skill. You don't have to pay the cost just once. You can play it as many times as you can as long as you have the Soul. Soul Blast 2, every draft trick you get is basically extra 5k power when you get a trigger in it. So you can get a lot of power if you've got a lot of Soul. And passes onto units as well. So very strong if you were to play like that, but I don't think it's that likely to get used. Next we have Divine Sense of Pastry. Not very good. There's a lot of Keter Sanctuary grade 1s that gain power and boosting anyway, so the 2k power doesn't really matter. I mean, it's good for the grade 3s, it makes them magic numbers, but who cares really if you've got Surga 1 already, like all these 13k bodies. You've got the counter charge card for the Divine Z. Obviously they have their own conditional issues, like for example, you may have to rely on playing an order with Surg 1 if your opponent has too many units, or if you've got, for example, the counter charge one, you obviously need to use your Vanguard skill first to be able to use the power buff. So there are some downsides, but ultimately I just think this is not worth it in the end, so I wouldn't play this. And obviously if you play Euphoria or if you play Aerial Sage, they're way better than this card anyway, so right off the bat. However, one thing that does separate is that it can bounce the hand if the attack hits. So just whatever really that skill. I mean, I don't really care enough about bouncing something like this back unless it's for PGing maybe, but Nubatama has their own version of this, which is way better because it actually draws when placed. Next we go to Devices of Kunafa. So Kunafa is actually a treat from the Middle East. It's funny because I came back from there and then they just reveal this card. There's always funny timings with things, but when it attacks and in the battle, it can go to Soul and give a unit 5k. But this only happens if you've basically called it via Vanguard ability, or if you've stood this card via the Vanguard ability. So you have to use your Vanguard to basically interact with this to stand or superior call it. So then, very handy because in theory, it's always going to be one of those cards where when you're reviewing your deck profile, you just look back on anything that can give power to another unit and maybe if you want to have like a restander to make use of, or anything of the sort, right, or some sort of guard ability, these are the sort of cards you're probably looking out for as well. Just something like this in the card pool. So it's always going to have advantages. It also has the whole soul gaining ability as well, which is pretty good as well. So it's not too bad. I don't think it's going to get played in these decks, but it's a utility generic card that just exists, as do many others. And whether they live or die is a whole other matter. They'll probably make a whole bunch of similar cards like this later down the line that will end up forgetting this ever existed. So next we have Vanguard. Vanguard is a very good grade 1 actually. It's a field control card, and unlike other stuff which don't have very good grades, like for example grade 3, this is a grade 1. So if you played in premium where you have no ride deck, at least you can still play the game normally and keep riding, right, rather than playing orders and grade 3s and bricking and all this stuff, right? But then there's some things really come out. So you do have to neg yourself to use this, because you have to place a unit in the same column as it, which means you have to kill one of your units to then trigger off the skill. So place over, and obviously that's it, you just neg. But then you have to also CB1 cost on top of that. However, the payoff I think is really good. Choose one of your opponent's units in the back row, and you can retire it. This is not once per turn, by the way. And also you can call on top of Vanguard as well. You don't have to call in front of it. So basically, what you could do is you can end up just stacking. You can use it like 3 times and just nuke your opponent's entire back row if they have, you know, filled up back row, for example. As long as you have 3 CB, of course. The CB part is a problem, but as long as you have CB to play with, then very good card. You can get around a lot of pesky stuff as well, especially like Fenrir, for example, in premium. You obviously have Claimer Harry, which makes Veratrum feel free. So when Veratrum and Vanguard are free, that's a problem, because it means they can just keep on board wiping. But if you actually make them actually properly pay the camp loss cost for Veratrum and Fenrir, then they're just going to run out of CB quickly, and then the deck just does nothing. So I would definitely say it's very good for now every Sanctuary deck to have this easy counter to Claim Harry. I've never really believed, I just don't think Fenrir is really as good as people think it is. Like, the thing is, it's very easy to run cards that counter Fenrir, and a lot of it is just people just walking to Melissa blindly, but I think there are a lot of ways you can, in theory, play around Fenrir. It's not that difficult. So very very handy. But also another thing in premium as well, and I know I'm supposed to be talking about Liael and Rezael, but the thing that really appeals to me here is that there's a deck that no one plays, which is DZ. Hardly anyone's playing. We have seen a few tops recently with it in Angel Feathers, but the problem is your opponent just whips out Gridora, and then they just stop you from being able to call out all your Zero Dragons. But why can they keep doing that? Because Gridora does CB1, and every time they count loss 1 and they spam that stride 4 turns in a row, they can do this, by the way, then they're able to just stop you from ever striding into, well, making use of Gizeh and dealing any damage. So basically, you end up having a bit of a tricky matchup against Gridora. But then to add more problems, even if you were to damage deny Gridora, then they have the Gentleman Moth, which is this grade 1 that pretends to be a grade 3 in the deck, so you could search it out, not just with grade 3 searches, but also Gridora. And then you just keep that main phase skill going of returning a card in a drop to the bottom of the deck and then countercharging 1. So you're putting a lot of strain on the Gentleman Moth if you're permanently retiring it, as opposed to just return to bomb, because what you're doing is you're taking them out of the game piece by piece. And I'm not sure if people actually play 4 copies of it, to be honest. I think it's possible people might be playing less now because there's just so much stuff to fit in these days in the deck. But just the idea of actually being able to hard retire it like constantly is always going to be good. And obviously this card can always keep existing as long as they haven't Mega Lantised it or Cradle Marketed it, then you can just keep on using this card over and over. But if you play like OTT Gizeh, you can always just use Fio, or yeah, something like Fio actually, just return it back to your deck and then call it back out again. So it's very handy for a whole multitude of reasons. But also in OTT, if you're worried about countercharge heals, for example, being used when they G-Guard, you can always just go into Ichikishima to Guard Restrictor, or you can just not attack. That's another way to deal with stuff. If you don't want to give them, for example, you don't want to swing into your opponent's Vanguard because your Vanguard is actually on the same level, power level, or greater than your opponent's Vanguard, and they don't give you any rear guards attack, you can always just go, okay, cool, stride Dragon King, activate skill, pass, or Kore Kazuchi as well. And obviously if you play Angel Feathers, you can always just go for something else like using any of the Angel Feathers rescue abilities, for example, to trigger as well, again, without swinging with your Vanguard. So it's just, it feels like this card is the solution to messing up with Gridora when you're playing Gizeh. So that's that. But obviously in any other format, in D format, always going to be a handy utility to have as well when you get into a format where back rows, very strong back rows start appearing. So this will always be a card that people will look back at. And if your opponent's relying on back rows, I mean, it may be worth the -1 to be fair if it makes a huge impact on your opponent's plays. Next we have Knight of Bright Bow, Krigwell. Krigwell only works in a deck that plays no G units. So just bear that in mind. Really sucks in premium, obviously, for that reason alone. But then to make it suck even more in premium, you need to actually be able to pay the cost by taking 2 cards from your ride deck that are either in your soul or in your drop zone, so stuff that's already been used to ride before, and then you just put them back into your ride deck face up. You also discard this card as well from your hand. So this is as long as you're on grade 3 or greater, by the way, so you can't do it early on in the game, which means you can't do any, like, you can't search for a specific card, which we'll get to in a sec. So look at 7 from top of your deck, choose up to 1 grade 3 or greater with a different card in from your Vanguard, from among them, reveal it and put it into your hand, and shuffle the deck. So you cannot search for the same card as your main ride line boss on turn 3, which means it's not very good with normal Persona Ride decks in that sense, but it is good with pseudo Persona Rides. So for example, Rezael Vita, which in the deck will be treated as a different name to your normal Rezael until the moment it's ridden. Once it's ridden, then that's it, you're kind of screwed there. But in the meantime, by turn 3, you can search for Rezael Vita until you've Persona ridden it. And then on top of that, the other targets you can also hit are rearguard grade 3s, namely Gebuelius, which is going to be a really good one for this set. And every nation has their own version, so Levy Dress can make use of this card as well, and any other deck that has important grade 3s can also make use of this. Now, if you're playing Liael, you have to be very careful with, because a lot of the times, obviously you can use the skill properly the first time round, but when you do it the second time round, you're going to have, 2 ride deck cards left, right? But the problem is with Liael, is that normally what happens is when you go to Divine Skill and Persona Ride, your main play, and then you try to proceed to Soul Blast your Liael from your soul, that's the ride line copy. And then what happens is when you put the ride line copy in your drop zone and then you ride over your newly ridden main deck copy, what happens is then you end up with a Vanguard that's from your ride deck, so you're still on maximum of 3 ride deck cards have been played out of the Vanguard circle. So you won't be able to use this card a second time until you then ride again and eventually just get rid of it altogether. So it's going to be pretty tricky to use a second time in Liael in some cases, so you just have to be very careful with that. But if this card also fails to resolve and find a grade 3, or you just choose not to add one, right? You just keep it in your hand. Obviously you lose your ride deck cards, but it's not that much for cost if you've already Soul Blast them, and you don't really care much about preserving your ride deck cards anyway. The only reason really to use them is if you need to actually meet some condition to put normal units back, especially early game, which you're not really using early game anyway that much. Actually, no, it's on turn 3, so yeah, you would. But that's pretty much more or less it. But then other thing as well is that you can still use it as a shield, so it's a 10k shield if you're on 3 damage, which is not too bad. Makes up a bit for it if it becomes a dead card by then. And then if you have if your opponent has a G unit a G unit in general, if your opponent's G zone has a card, then you can bind a grade 3 or greater from your soul or drop, and he gets an additional 10k shield. So this doesn't care about the ride deck or anything, right? You just straight up have a 20k shield just because your opponent has a G unit, G zone. Obviously not useful in premium because you still have to play no G units in your deck anyway to be able to make use of this, but it's alright. It's not as good as Topaz in a sense, because obviously Topaz is easier to meet the condition off. It's only really scaling up, just like these other 2 cards. It's only really just scaling up for the purpose of this matchup. It's just a hater against those sorts of against G zone decks, more or less. But yeah, very interesting card. I don't know if it'll get played, but it's definitely a handy one to have. Next we have Knights of Returning Spear Inos, which is also another card that I don't think is as likely to get used, but this is specific to Rezael now. So when you place over it, very similar to Dual Knight Liael, except you have to place it via Rezael's skill, so you can't just normal call. Then you give that newly called unit a 10k power, just like Dual Knight Liael. So very handy. I think even though you're getting a weaker attack if you put this in the front row, I think the weaker attack, being the first ones before you use Rezael's skill, is actually not too bad, because a lot of times people are going to take the first attack as well, while you don't really want them to necessarily be guarding it. So, no guarding it. So then that kind of brings kind of another thing where it's like when you're on triple drive off of the Divine skill for Rezael, or if you're using Gebuelius actually, then you're just getting more triggers. You're trying to hit more crits. So like if you put your opponent from 4 to 5 theoretically with this, right, maybe it's just, it just feels like, well, what's the point in going for 20k betas in situations like that? But obviously that doesn't always apply, this example I'm talking about. So what you may also consider doing if you were running this, which I don't think it's going to be popular again, but you could always put in the back row if you want to have like a 20k Tethel. Obviously this isn't including Persona Ride power, and then you still want to be able to hit bigger on your early attack, but then you're able to then hit even more bigger in your follow-up attack after you've done your drive checks. This card is good for that as well, and you can make this really powerful Gabuelius column if you want to as well. So there's a lot more kind of strength now in the deck. There's a lot more powering up and stuff going on if you want to play in this direction. And this is not the only thing that can actually gain you a lot more power either. There's other stuff that can do that too, such as this whole series of grade 1 restanders. So they both almost do the same thing. They're grade 1s that restand as long as you meet your Vanguard's condition, which is, in the case of Liael, binding the card in the same column as this. In the case of Rezael, it's if you superior core in the same column as it. But this one has to Soul Blast 1, whereas the Liael one can be just used constantly. Now the Liael one's really good, I think, compared to the Rezael one, because Rezael one only uses that column once anyway, because there's no divine skills being used to allow you to use Liael's condition twice. But Rezael can only really go off once, and the Soul Blast 1, it doesn't really matter in this deck. I mean, Liael is the one that cares about the fact it doesn't have Soul Blast 1, but this one here, I mean, unless you're playing Reedy or something, you're going to have an abundance of soul. Sometimes Soul Blast is actually good because it means you can use Nilbris again. So there's always an upside there. It's sort of like why some people play Kudwala, why some people play Painkiller Angel, for these sorts of reasons, just more ways, sometimes even Nobia, or even Divine Skills, your other way you can basically do it, but then you're forced to use Divine Skill. Tethel can, but if you don't use your Order Engine, and then place Tethel after, then you don't get to make use of that Soul Blast. So there's always some downsides there as well. But I'm not sure how likely this is to be used, because again, the use isn't really that big. It just feels like you're trying to overwin. So I think people would rather play Serguan and just have it there. But if it does get played, it'll probably be like a 1 or something off, maybe. I don't know. I don't think it's going to be one of those cards that gets played at heavier copies. I think the one for Liael will be played at heavier copies, because this is really good Liael. It makes a huge difference. Because in a deck like Liael, obviously, if you're playing Serguan, it's already quite easy to be able to dedicate to a column. But then having a restander, if you're able to just have it in like behind a grade 2, the thing with Liael is that when you get to your turn 3, it's very easy for your CB1 bind thing to just be all over a 5k shield. How does that happen? Because there's two ways you can go about it, right? Normally, if this card didn't exist, which is that you attack with a grade 2 10k. During your turn 3, because your bind zone abilities, they require your own bind zone having a card, which would have to happen when Liael binds. So then that means you're attacking with Idaras for only 10k, you're attacking with Salvador for only 13k until you use Liael's skill. So then the problem here is that your opponent can just drop 5k, and then it's like, okay, now here's the actual attack, CB1 core, or you can boost to make them guard more. But if they decide, oh, you know what, I'll just take this attack, and then they get a trigger, cool, your Idras is stronger now by 20k, but now it just goes back to being a 5k to guard because it got a damage trigger. So there's things like that. So there's a whole bunch of situations where you just feel like your opponent just gets away lightly on turn 3 with a 5k shield, which is such an easy thing to guard with. I mean, there's always just a dump of rubbish that's been called early game as an intercept and all this stuff. But here, it's at least when you're doing 18k swing with this, and then you just get 28k Idaras afterwards, after you've bound Idaras, for example, then you're forcing a 10k shield each time, whether or not they have a damage trigger, which I think makes it a lot better. So this is really good for that reason, this card. And then if you're on Divine Skill, using it 3 times, so you're basically just giving 8k 3 times. If you get triggers, you can give this the trigger power, so it's even more than just the 8k booster. It becomes like an 18k, 28k, whatever booster, right? And then Gabuelius is also going to gain drive checks, and it's also going to help you stack your deck further. So your chance of actually being able to pull this off are much greater than they used to be. So this is very good for all those reasons as well. This one I think is just much weaker. It's a rare actually, and this one's a common, but I think this is just much better than this one here. But obviously there's going to be a lot of deck building issues, because the Keter pile is just so good, especially in Liael, because Liael has very good filtering in that you've got a ride line, which is Soul Blast 1, draw 2, and then discard a normal unit or discard 2. This is the grade 1 card. So basically, if you have something like Divine Sense of Biscotti as well, which is Energy Blast 3, you can even draw again. So you end up finding all these pieces like Tethel, Serguan, Wisdom of the Beginning that cleared the world, which is the Angelical Order, that you may be familiar with, all these cards, right, it's much easier to draw into them, and you're not using the Rezael ride line, right, where you're just calling a grade 1 or something already early in the game, and then just having all this weird, awkward field cannibalization going on. Like, you actually have a clean board, and you just make very good use of Tethel. You get to actually call stuff you want to call. Then, speaking of Biscotti, though, Biscotti, which is Energy Blast 3, it does clash with this, Perna Cetra. Perna Cetra also requires Energy Blast 3. So when your grade 3 or greater Liael is placed, so that can be via Divine Skill or Persona Ride, or even just Ride Deck riding, Energy Blast 3, bind and draw. So it's a bit awkward because obviously if you've been relying on Biscotti, or if you want to rely on Biscotti, it's going to compete with that. But even if you were to play the odd copy, it kind of isn't really that great, because the first skill during your turn, if your bind zone has a card with the same card name as this unit, it gets extra 5k. So basically it punishes you for playing less copies of this in a way. So you do have to be a bit careful there as well. Too, I'm not sure how many copies I would play if I was to play this, that is, because I'm not even sure if I would. But the self-binding is quite handy. But the thing is, the timing is awkward. If your opponent ends up killing this, you can't really just go Persona Ride draw. Or if you use an early game, your opponent swings into this, then they're playing around you, more or less. It may even be that you just go as far as putting the back row. And in fact, if you're using it during your Liael, especially Divine Skill turn as well, it's very weird in that it means then you're not able to kind of... You have to basically attack with this earlier, which is a bit awkward. And I don't think you'd really want to particularly do that sometimes. I think usually you want to keep your other rear guard, the one that isn't being bound, particularly if that's what's happening. You'd rather just keep it available on the field, so that it can be like the finisher attack of that turn usually. So it's got some issues. The main appeal of this card, honestly, is just the fact that it can turbo your bind zone whenever you use Liael. So if you've ended up in a situation, for example, where you've done Counter Blast 1 in the early game, because you're playing the Order Engine, whatever, or Aspronia, or Liael and Valtrosa, those Dual Nation cards, then and there's a different Liael to the one we're talking about right now. They have two cards with similar names called Liael for some reason. Obviously, your opponent can damage deny you. That means then Liael slows down. You can't build up your bind zone. It also means you can't PG. It also means that Salvar Dragon can't power up. So obviously there's all kinds of reasons. But Salvar Dragon, I'm not sure how likely it's going to get played. I mean, you could play like the odd copy. You don't have to play too many copies, right? But sometimes not being able to bind is a downside. Sometimes you just want to use Liael on turn 3, not so you can do pressure, because the pressure sucks anyway in some cases, but just so you can have the extra bind zone card, because you need it for your setup. Then Sequence Wizard. So Sequence Wizard, when it's placed on rare during your main phase, you have a grade 3 or greater Liael as your Vanguard. Canvas 1, look at top 5 of your deck, and then choose up to 1 grade 3 or less unit from among and call it to rare and shuffle your deck. So it's a bit like a Kybre, or actually no, it's more like a Liael and Valtrosa, except it only works on turn 3 onwards, but you can call pretty much any grade 3 or less. And it only works if it's called during the main phase. So you can't do any multi-attack extenders like Kybre, for example. So it's got its downsides, but the upsides are very good. Obviously, filling up your board. The deck does struggle with filling up a board. I've noticed that's why I actually played Salvar Dragon. It's because I don't want to rely on having too many boosters, because the problem is if you can't boost, then you might as well just have a grade 3, because grade 3s hit magic numbers without boosters, right? So that's kind of why I played Salvar Dragon in my Liael list. But with stuff like this, and also that grade 1 restander, cards like Salvar Dragon or standalone grade 3s applying pressure aren't as important on that principle anymore. Obviously, there's going to be Gabuelius, which is good for other reasons, but not for the reasons that Salvar was being played. So it does make it so you don't need to rely on Salvar, because the restanding grade 1 obviously helps make mad numbers of grade 2s and helps you kind of double down your field more. And also you're filling up your board more easily. You're finding pieces as well. So if you find the dog, the one that countercharges, you're able to pretty much just turn it into like a free 13k booster for the whole turn, like extra powers in, which is pretty nice. And you can also just look for Idras to set up your draw engine, which I think that's another problem I've had with Liael, where I failed to be able to get Idras early on, so then my defense kind of wasn't that good, because you're not binding to draw, and if you're not doing it on your divine skill turn, it's even less value, because you can't get draw 2, and you can't get like 10k power total accumulated onto your Vanguard. I think, yeah, like you can't, sorry, 5k and 5k even, because you're resetting your Vanguard. But there's always been those downsides. But obviously Idras does use more soul, so Sequence Wizard is very handy, because when your other unit is bound by your Vanguard's ability, it gains 5k and you may soul charge 1. So You've now got a Soul Charge engine. You're not relying on Sagittarius, or you don't even have to rely as much on the crit trigger Soul Charging itself, just to desperately Soul Charge. Now you can just use this grade 2 to get your Soul Charge. If you've done Divine Skill, it stacks. You can use it twice in the turn, so it becomes 20k, and it becomes Soul Charge 2 as well. So that's very handy, because then you've got your cards like Euphoria as well. If you've got Spare Soul for that, you can more easily get the Spare Soul and basically just distribute more 5ks. So Liael's more aggressive than it used to be because of all these cards. You can even make Gabuelis like a 33k on top of its own ability. There's just so much stuff now that makes the deck just much better now. It makes up for not having Salvo Dragon if you choose to cut it as well. So pretty nice in a way. Euphoria has become a much better card thanks to Sequence Wizard. Then next we have Blessed Dragon Gabuelis. So Gabuelis, when it's placed on rearguard circle, Soul Blast 1, look at top card of your deck, put it on top of bottom of your deck. If you put it on the bottom of your deck, it gains extra 5k until the turn. So it's a bit like the OTT promo reminds me of, which I've started playing around with recently, where you look at top card of your deck, if you put it on the bottom, you can Cabos 1 and give 5k to Vanguard. Very OTT-like. And then just being able to have a base 18k off the bat, you can basically make it that way by calling it. Obviously, if it's already existing on the board from the previous turn, then it's pretty bad. You'd rather have Salvo Dragon in that case, but there are ways in which you're kind of compensating. There's ups and downs to both cards. When it attacks, if your damage zone has 4 or more cards, for good or bad actually, this one, because this is where things get a bit awkward. Until end of that battle, this unit gets the ability, sorry, it gets 5k, and if it was placed on rearguard by the ability of your Vanguard with Fated one in its name, so that's Rezael or Liael, and no drive checks were performed for the battle, your rearguard attack this turn, you can plus 1, and it gains an additional 5k, and drive -1, oh sorry, basically it's just a 1 drive Vanguard, just to make it very simple. So you can basically make it so 18k when it's placed, but otherwise if it attacks, it still can go for that 18k anyway, but if it's met both conditions, it's a 23k, unless you keep the trigger on top of your deck. But then if it's a trigger, obviously you're going to gain more power for the drive check, right? And then there's just so much good stuff with this, because you're placing it when your Vanguard swings, so you meet the timing of being able to use it with the drive check of Rezael, which is so good. Increases your chance of getting a crit as well. Same thing, so both Rezael and Liael are able to make good use of this. And Liael especially has a big problem with triggers, because there's a lot of normal units cycling back into the deck. The deck does not do any proper compression, so you don't really hit triggers that often. In fact, when you do your reride Liael, it doesn't really feel like you're getting a reselling Vanguard. It feels like you're just doing an extra rearguard swing, but your opponent just gets tilted into being like, but what if they get a crit? Maybe I will use this PG. That's really the only difference, because otherwise if you had like a rearguard attacking with 1 damage, your opponent would just take it, right? But if just for the fact that you can scare them with drive, you can bait out someone's hand that is already dominating with so much shield because of intimidating them with a drive check. But really, most of the time you don't hit a crit. But cards like this, unless you stack your deck and then put it on bottom, so you're basically scrying an extra card. But then this also gets a drive check, so you're scrying twice basically extra cards. So now Liael has a much better chance of hitting crits, which means the Liael turns are much stronger than they've ever been in the past, just because of this card. Sagittarius is basically just straight up dead. Not just because of this card being a soul charger and helping in that regard, but also this card being a stacker as well, and just being so much better than Sagittarius anyway. So it's just really, really good. But the only thing is that the 4 damage condition you have to be really careful of. So here's the problem. If you drive check a heal trigger, because it only checks for limit break when he attacks as a rearguard, right? Not when you place him. So you hit that heal trigger, that's it, you've lost your 4 damage. So now you just vanilla called this card basically as like an 18k beta. That's obviously a problem when that happens. So you have to be very careful with this. You have to consider, what's the likelihood of me healing? Should I go to 5 damage just so that I can reduce the chances of this backfiring basically? Should I maybe just not play heal triggers? Should I maybe not just play should I just not play the dark OT? Maybe the red OT is better to play. Even the Keter OT is not too bad, but I think the red OT is much better now than the dark OT because of this card. So I would probably lean towards red OT rather than dark OT for this reason. I don't normally think about which OT to play actually unless I'm like going to a shop challenge and I'm like, yeah, maybe I should have thought about which OT I should have played, because they're so sacky. I just don't care enough about OTs. Like I spend the least energy and time just thinking about which OT to run usually. I'm more just concerned with like composition of the actual deck, like the rest of the 49 cards in the deck. So then, yeah, all in all, very good. The other thing as well is that sometimes what you might have is you might have like 2 rear guards that are stronger in the front row. you can just pull this to the back row if you've already got in your field, because it might not be that good on the field currently right now. So then what you could just do is just bind it later. That's a line of play you can go with as well if you wanted to, potentially. And then you just call it over one of your front rows later. But that's the thing with Liael, is that your opponent gets punished if they don't attack into it, because unless you have another copy in your hand. Because what happens is that it's like Idras, where Idras is a damage sponge, because if it's killed, it stops you from being able to even draw twice if you do Divine Skill. So Rezael does not make use of this as a damage sponge, because Rezael calls from drop zone. So basically, if they kill it and put it in the drop zone, they're just helping you meet the condition. The only thing that changes is that you might end up calling over it for no reason. Well, for a reason obviously, but like you just neg one, basically hard neg one. But in Liael, it's okay if it's still on the board, because you just bind it and then just call a new copy because you had it on the field in the first place. So that's another thing as well. So really, you just got to watch out for the 4 damage issue, and also just be a bit aware. I think with Rezael, you probably play 1 to 2 copies of this, because it's just so tight on space. So many grade 3, so many cards with 0 shields that you would run in Rezael. But Liael has more space because it doesn't have a second boss card anyway. So it's much easier to play in Liael as well. So then this takes us to the last one, which is Fata King of Miracles Rezael Vita, or sorry, I saw the word Kiseki, which is the Japanese title of the Trails games. Kiseki means miracles, but for some reason English series they changed to Trails. I think Miracles does fit it based on my playthrough of the Trails games. They do kind of have quite a bit of miraculous stuff going on in that series. But the skill of this, it's regarded as the original Rezael on the Vanguard circle. That is not in the deck, so you can search out with Craigwell. But during your turn, this unit gets 5k for every Rezael in your soul, and it gains all divine skills. The reason that they word it that way, why they say all divine skills rather than choose a divine skill, the reason they do it that way is because it's a passive continuous skill. You're not supposed to designate if it's a continuous skill, so that's the whole point. It's just so that you're not making any decisions as the player, but really it's only just going to be Rezael. You can only divine skill once. It still stands the same way. When this unit attacks a Vanguard, cost count +1, so this bit is the same as the original Rezael. Choose 2 cards with some of their grades being equal to or less than your damage zone and call them to rearguard. And then there's the extension ability, which is a new part for Vita. You put a grade 3 or greater Rezael in its name from your hand to soul, choose a grade 3 or less from your drop, and then you call it to rearguard. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, all the called units gain 5k until turn. So more powering up makes up for not playing Gigantic Smasher. It's a lot more pressure in this deck now, just from that alone. But then the fact that you can call anything regardless of your damage just for putting a Rezael into your soul, it means you can basically do 5 attacks, solid attacks, good attacks, while on 2 damage. So that's also another thing that makes this pretty good as well. You can call 2 grade 2s as well with this, so that's something you couldn't do before. So I think this is really good. It makes the deck a lot more stronger now, more pressure. I think Rezael does get a lot better because of this, but I think the one downside of Rezael, the big downside that they're getting from the new support, is that they're relying a lot on 0 shield. So you're playing more Rezaels, for better or for worse. I think having alternate Persona Rides is great, being able to draw into more Persona Rides, but then the fact you have to actually pay a cost of discarding a Rezael, or sorry, moving it to Soul, does kind of work both ways a bit, but it can be a bit tricky sometimes. But it's there. It's a line of play that exists, so you can slap harder against your opponent. But if you draw into too many of these, then obviously it's going to be a problem. I think when you mulligan, it makes it a bit safer to mulligan all your Rezaels now, because what I think a lot of people would have done this. When you mulligan, you keep your Persona Ride usually. Unless maybe if you're going, I don't know, if you're going second and you're worried about getting aggroed, I don't know. I think that kind of just comes based on like your mood sometimes as well. But yeah, normally you do try to keep a Persona Ride in your hand, especially going first. But now you can just kind of hard mulligan, and the risk is much lower, because worst case scenario, you just Persona Ride the old Rezael again. But then you're also able to then just keep on aiming for lower grade cards and just rush your opponent, which I think is good, because the more grade 3s you play, the more inclined you are to mulligan hard for early game cards. I think that's kind of a general principle that does kind of apply a lot more with mulligan. So yeah, all in all, a lot of good support. I think it's going to be 1 to 2 good wellies probably. I think Hostage Liael would be nice to play, but I don't know how you'd fit all this stuff in so far, because you're obviously playing the order as the set order as well, If you want to play the Keter toolbox, then that's even more potential zero shields, regardless pieces of zero shield, especially with drive checking into them as well, which just adds more to the fluff in your hand as well. So there's a lot of risks as well as we're doing all this. But I do think as well, just the fact that at least if you have too many Rezaels and you do attack with this, but again, you have to do it before you drive check. You have to put it in before. You can't put it in after the drive checks, so you can't just check into them, which is why it was very important in Handmade when Akina top decked this to actually be able to do the combo. Although he didn't actually, he could have still found other ways to win, like just sack more triggers maybe, I don't know. But yeah, this is very good for just kind of offsetting abundant Rezaels, which you can convert into draws, because what would you be calling? Surguan if you're still playing the Keter pile, or you can be playing Nilbarus, which is also another way, so another unit that you're calling because you did that. Actually, Surguan's not really the right one I should be comparing to. I think you'd be calling Surguan no matter what with the base ability, but you'd be calling maybe 2 Nilbaruses, for example, or even a Nobia if you play Nobia. So there's a lot of upsides here as well, like converting that Rezael into an actual shield value in the process as well. So yeah, that is probably it. Tell me what you think. I'll probably play more of these in Liael. Probably, I'm not sure how many though, but no more than 3. I don't think 4. I think maybe 3, but you've now got Euphoria, which is easier to use than before because of more soul charging, so you could maybe get away with less copies. But 3, I think, makes it so that, I mean, the thing is that if you bind into it twice, you are stacking through your deck more, but you're soul blasting every time you do it. So then there's the argument that maybe even 2 could work, because you might just intend to only ever use it once. And even then, Idras is kind of better, I think, to rely on, because you're actually plussing harder more easily with it. It's a safer option card as well, and this is also a bit for pseudo limit break too. But obviously, you always want to be able to have 1 on field to target to bind, and then 1 in your deck to be able to get out. So if you get it in the damage and you have this on field, that'll be a problem. But otherwise, and even if you put in your binds on, that's also a problem, which I guess gives you the argument of why playing this is good, because you can use Liael to put your bind zone cards back into your deck more easily as well, especially if you had a turn 3 where you slowed down on being able to build up your bind zone. So yeah, there's a lot of things to think about. And also another thing as well, I forgot, Changu mentioned this to me, Aspronia. So the Stoicheia Donation card, what you can do here is you can basically discard this for the ride line, or even for the grade 1 ride line skill, and then you can just go Aspronia, look at the top card of your deck, and then mill it. And then if it's normal unit, great, because you're just fueling your grade 2 ride line condition anyway. But in addition, you can then call this from your drop zone, and then you can Soul Blast 1, again you're fueling a ride line condition, and then you look at the top of your deck, and then you can stack a top bottom and gain 5k. So pretty much you just get basically a few extra chances to try and hit a trigger, which means you've got a much higher chance of hitting a crit in the early game. And basically it just kind of compensates a bit for not playing or not having Tethel rush. So if you wanted to like just not play all that stuff, you can go in this direction as well. You can go for Aspronia. Aspronia's not too bad as well in general. I mean, it is a stack obviously, but it also lets you recover units. But in a way, this is also kind of similar for its function when you're trying to build up a board as well. You can recover also stuff like Idras, so if you're running out of Idrases, you can just call it because your opponent killed Idras last turn or something, you could just do it that way. But I think really like something that's going to be very big now is the countercharge dog is going to be, I think, more important than ever, because before I wasn't really using it or making good use of it, but now I think the dog is going to be more important in these decks because there's a lot more ways of counterblasting as well. So more worth it now, because if you're calling it knowing that you're going to countercharge and still counterblast to make use of some other big play, that makes it better, right? But I never liked it before, because what would happen is I'd be in games, too many games, or at least tested hands as well, but even the shop challenges, there's only the finals of one shop challenge did it end up being a problem. But generally I've always had the counterblast I needed, because it was operating at like just about break even. So I was never really kind of like, oh, I've got too much face of damage, this card's useless, throw it away. So there's going to be now more of that at play as well. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you really think about the new support, and I will catch you guys later. Bye.